This video clip accompanies the biogeography virtual field trips. We're on Mt Keira and we're at the second site, the moist Bluegum-Blackbutt Forest, which is like a bit of a woodland on a ridge. It's on the east side of Clive Bissell Drive, just a few hundred metres east from the first site, so it's not very far away from the first site. Getting a bit of an overview of the site. What sort of topography do we see? Well, it's a lot flatter than the other one. It's basically flat. How many layers of vegetation are there? How tall are the trees? These are the kinds of things that we need to think about when we come to a site. What sort of shrub layer is there? You can see that there's quite a few more than the previous site. Herbs, and what sort of ground cover is there? Again, we want to think about how much shade there is and what sort of temperature it might be. So this is quite a bit more exposed than the previous site, and on a hot day we would feel it a little bit warmer. You can see the light coming through the edge there of the photograph at the back. So this is on the edge of a cliff. It's quite a bit more exposed, so it'll be a lot drier than that first site. We're also interested in the kind of soil and substrate. A big difference here is the rocks on the site. What signs of disturbance are there? So if we have a look what's underfoot, again we have a lot of leaf litter with some bark. We push that aside, and there's a soil with quite a bit of organic matter still, but it's a bit sandier and drier than the previous site. Having a look at the vegetation layers, there are a number of tall trees and quite a prevalent small tree and shrub layer. How does it differ from the previous site? A main difference here is the dominant ground cover, which is a plant called Lomandra. So Lomandra replaces the ferns in the previous site. Lomandra is like a tough sort of grassy type plant, and there aren't as many vines here. There's much fewer vines, so it's not as complex in that way. What about the dominant tree species? This site has a number of eucalyptus trees, which are traditionally quite hard to identify because there's more than 600 species and they also hybridize. So to identify them, we need to look at the bark and the leaves and the fruit. Sometimes it's hard to identify individual trees, especially when the leaves and the fruit are so high up. But there are some really good local resources. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the trees in our area, we'd recommend these books. And they'll take you through some of the steps in identifying. So for instance, with bark, you might start off thinking, is it a smooth bark? Is it part or full? By that we mean, does the bark come all the way up the tree, or does it stop halfway, or even lower down? What sort of texture is the bark? Does it have scribbles, or is it flaky? Does it have ribbons? Is it stringy, or is it like an iron bark, which is really hard? Leaf shape and colour helps identify species, as does the fruit. Looking at the shape and the number of fruit per cluster, as well as the size. Often the width is what's specified. Flower colour is helpful. Eucalyptus flowers can be anything from white through to quite bright red, but of course that will only help if the tree's in flower. So here we have a blackbutt tree. It's got a fine bark that doesn't go all the way up, so it's got a part bark. And there in the middle of that picture is a Sydney bluegum, which is also a eucalyptus tree. It has ribbons of bark you can just about make out hanging down. Maybe it's next time you're in the forest out for a bushwalk, have a look at the trees and see if you can find some with ribbons of bark. Again, we can look for clues. So we have turpentine on this site. You can see that from its strange shape fruit. Here are some blackbutt fruit. They're very sort of round and solid. And we also have white box on this site, just like on the other side. They've got quite small and delicate fruit. So the other really important species here, as you mentioned before, is the mat rush, Lomando longifolia. And we've also got things like this sassafras, this is a little juvenile just growing up. And there's some young vines, this could possibly be sarsaparilla. There's a lot of moss and lichen on the rocks. These aren't usually included in forest classification, but they are still quite important. The moss in particular helps slow the water passage through a forest. What about signs of disturbance? It's more set back from the road, so there are fewer weeds, but there are still quite a few mountain bike paths, so still a fair bit of disturbance.